Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 5th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of June 23rd, 2024, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I'm excited that yet again, here we are getting nearer to the end of June. It's amazing how fast this stuff goes. Yet we are still in this growing season, as I like putting it, the season after Pentecost, where we really can dig in and get a little bit more of the meat and potatoes, I would say, of the gospel in certain ways. And when we're thinking about that and looking at that for this week, I think there's a lot of little intricacies and things that we can think about and process. And especially this week, there's a lot of different texts that we can go through and some things that for us to be contemplating and thinking about. But with that being said, we need to take a look at last week's question, which was, who or what are some things we often overlook and we shouldn't? And we got some responses this week talking about a lot of different sanitary workers or jobs that we see as low level that in a lot of ways are really important. People who plow roads if you're in an area where it snows. People who work with asphalt in the summers. People who do some of these grunt jobs that we often overlook until you really need them. And sometimes we don't even necessarily recognize the person who's doing it. It's those types of jobs are so important. Even sometimes these different plants and ecosystems in and of themselves. A person brought up dandelions this last week and how there is an aspect of, yes, they're a nuisance weed and they're invasive species, but I would also argue they are also can be food. Dandelion is a food that you can eat. And so a lot of these different things that we often overlook, and I'd argue a lot of our ecosystem and how our ecosystem works. I think a lot of times we as people don't spend enough time really spending the time to understand how our ecosystem works and what our role is within the ecosystem. And thus, I think we have this feeling of warring, if you want to put it that way, between human civilization and nature instead of working in harmony as a lot of times they really should be. But we have a lot to go through, so let's just jump right into it. And the reason that I say that is we have three alternative first readings this week. So we'll jump into the first one. The first alternative first reading this week is from 1 Samuel chapter 17, optionally verse 1a, optionally 4 through 11, optionally 19 through 23, and 32 through 49. This is a fairly familiar story, and this is the story of David and Goliath. And what we have here is that the Philistines are against Israel. And what has happened is you have this stalemate. There is this large man, 6 cubits tall, who is coming out, and every day the Israelites are afraid to fight him. David is sent to the front lines to be around his brothers and to see and check in on their morale and bring them some food and such. And while he's there, he recognizes this and it's like, what is going on? Why are we doing this? Why are we having this stalemate and no one's fighting? And they're talking about how big and tall this man is. So David says, well, I'll do it. Well, then he goes to King Saul. Saul then is giving him all this armor that he's needed. And David's like, this is not my style. I have fought off lions and bears myself, protecting sheep. Let me do this my way. And so David goes and collects stones. And the next day when Goliath comes out, David goes out, they're all but laughing. He has his slingshot, he fires his stone, hits him square in the forehead, and he falls down face first. And this is then the defeat of the Philistines. So this idea of how the Israelites are quite terrified in a lot of ways. And yet David then is able to cut through this chaos, cut through all the fear, all the what is going on, what's going to happen to us. There's no way we can defeat this person, and yet is able to deliver the message of what is needed to be done. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 9, verses 9 through 20. This is a psalm of recognition of God being with the oppressed, God being a person that we put our trust in. This is why we are singing praise to who God is. And that when we go through suffering, we're not going through it alone. We recognize that God is with us and God is continuing to work through that to be able to rise us up and help us prevail over, maybe in a way that we don't expect, but in a way for us to be able to get us to where God is wanting us to be. One of the other alternative first readings this week is also from 1 Samuel chapter 17 verses 57 to chapter 18 verse 5, and then chapter 18 verse 10 through 16. This then begins the feud between Saul and David. And that David has kind of been looked at as a little bit of a hero here, and they are presenting the head of the Philistine to Saul. Saul does not take this well. But while this is all happening, we have the beginning of the bond between David and Jonathan and how they care so deeply about each other and making a covenant that they are going to kind of protect each other. Jonathan, in fact, in verse 4 is taking off the robe off himself and putting it on David, this recognition of royalty, if you want to put it that way. Saul instead decides to send an army after David, and this is the beginning of how these two are going to communicate and work together to be able to show care and compassion for each other, but also being able to protect each other, as Jonathan being an inside person and making sure that David isn't killed. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 133, all 3 verses of it. And this is the recognition of when we are living in unity, that this is a blessing and that we get the pouring over of oil running down into the beard, looking at that as wisdom being thrown into and brought into us, and that the Lord is trying to provide blessings through having unity together. The final first reading this week is out of Job chapter 38, the first 11 verses of it. So this is kind of, again, I feel you're kind of dropping in the middle of a story here, but this has kind of been this back and forth, and Job, who's been losing everything and trying to seek the wisdom of friends, but then finally God kind of stepping in and talking about here with Job, where were you at the foundations of the earth, as we get in verse 4? Where is all knowledge coming from? Where is all of this that has come to be? Girt your loins up like a man, as we get in verse 3, recognizing that God has done all these things and recognizing that God has been the one who has provided all these amazing things for us. And it's so easy for us to complain. It's so easy for us to forget to recognize God in that. And in doing that, whatever is coming our way, this recognition of what God is trying to say of, why would I suddenly stop and abandon you? Why would I suddenly not care? If I have done all these things and I've been there since the foundations of the earth, why would I suddenly not care about you? The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 107, the first 3 verses, and also 23 through 32. So this then is that praise and recognition in the first 3 verses that the steadfast love of the Lord endures forever, and that He has redeemed us from our trouble. He has been there in the difficult times, and when the storms come and the things go crazy and we wonder what is going on, like we hear in Job and what we'll hear about in the gospel text this week, the distress, the storm, all of that God is still with us. God's love still endures. And this is why we are coming together, that in the storm that we all are united together in this faith that we share. The second reading this week is out of 2 Corinthians chapter 6, the first 13 verses of it. This text is reminding us, again, as there are tumult and trials and craziness that goes on in this world, and that there is going to be hardships that we will endure and go through, calamities, beatings, imprisonment, riots, labor, sleepless nights, hunger, recognizing that the Spirit of God, the love of God, the care that God has for us continues on, and that God is going to continue to be there for us. And we as children should continue to be running toward God in those times, recognizing that we are not abandoned, that we are going through this and God is walking there along with us through these difficult times as they come. Through the highs and through the lows, God continues to be there. Finally, the gospel text this week is out of Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. This is a fairly familiar text. This is a text of after performing a lot of healings. In verse 35, in the evening, Jesus tells his disciples, let's go across the other side. They're in a boat. He falls asleep. There's a great windstorm that comes up and the boat is shaking all over the place. And to the point where they are scared. We get in verse 38, teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Which is stating something, remembering that a large section of these disciples are fishermen. They are very experienced on the water to the point where they are scared, is stating something. Jesus wakes up and says, peace, be still. The wind ceases. Jesus then responds in Mark's gospel, why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? And the disciples are in awe, but also fear. This recognition of who is this, that the wind and the sea obey the words of what Jesus is saying, along with what have we actually just seen. So this idea of complete awe and complete, in a certain way, another type of fear of what is actually going on here that we don't fully grasp and understand. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plugs. Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between the Sermon Brainwaves podcasts or commentaries to discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some direction with this podcast, give me some different ideas, along with having different commentaries and different podcasts to listen to. So, if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but along with the art, prayers, hymns, colors, and daily devotions. Super, super important. And there's some great resources over there. If you haven't checked that out, I'd highly recommend it. I really enjoy how they lay out the stuff week to week. Plus, they have a lot of these different holidays that maybe your church tradition doesn't necessarily follow, but then you can at least see what the different texts are and maybe learn something. And I've definitely learned a few things along the way with doing that. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that. Finally, I'd highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter that has the weekly reflection in it. And it goes through a lot of ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies to be able to bring into their text, along with some different ideas on just general creation care. If you enjoy listening to this podcast for almost a half an hour each week, you're really going to look forward to getting this in your inbox. I know that I enjoy looking through it myself. So if you haven't checked that out, that'll be the first link down in the show notes. One of the things that I'm going to start off with, which I don't do very often, but I'm going to plug one of the former podcasts that I did on this. And where I took it was talking about fear. And fear is the only human emotion that we can actually test in a lab because it is very clear and evident when someone is fearful. And so from that, there's a lot of different resources and things that I got into talking about fear and how that can open up some different things on how we are told not to fear. So I'd highly recommend checking that one out. That one is from 6 years ago, but it's still some really good content over there. I'd highly recommend checking that out. This week, when I'm looking at this text and thinking about this text, I wanted to approach it a little bit differently. Because what are we seeing when we're hearing Jesus state, why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? This idea of how, like we talked about 6 years ago, when you are fearful, you are worried about self-preservation. You're not worried about others. You're not worrying about caring about others. There's also times like we get in the 2 Corinthians text that we have to be able to recognize that we are going to go through hardships. The idea that we're not going to go through hardships is absolutely ludicrous. And we can see it out in nature, and we'll get there with that. But we go through these hardships, and in going through these hardships, it helps strengthen us overall. Job becomes stronger as Job goes through the trials and tribulations that Job goes through. David, part of the seeking after God's own heart is due to the fact that first we had last week where David is overlooked becoming the king of Israel. We then have now David goes in, recognizes everyone else is scared, but I have a God who loves and cares about me. Why would I be afraid? Goes in, takes care of Goliath, and everybody else is just like, what is going on? And to the point where then, when you have the continuation of the story, they go and present, look, this was the person who was being so fearful to you. Here is the head of Goliath. And Saul is so jealous, and so focused on Saul's self, that Saul then decides to send armies after David. And thankfully, Saul's own son, Jonathan, is willing to be a person to team up with David to help David continue to be this person. And it's again this sign and indication how God sends people into our lives at different points of our lives to help us through difficult situations. And Jonathan very much does that for David. So where can we find this out in the world beyond the scripture? And I think we have a fairly obvious one this week. And we've talked about some of this type of stuff before, but wolves hunting is very fascinating to watch. And especially as you understand that culturally around the world, we have seen wolves as these ferocious hunters, ruthless, just out for blood and the sport of it. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Wolves are actually very unsuccessful. Typically, wolves are only successful somewhere between 10 and 20% of the time with their hunts. And there's times where what do you define as a hunt, per se, with a wolf? Because sometimes what they're doing is to test the fitness of the animals that are around them, to see if it's worth putting really forth the effort to try. Sometimes the wolves are doing other things where they're young wolves and they're trying to test some of their ability and figure out themselves as they're learning and growing, how do I do this? Is this a type of animal that I'm willing to send the rest of the pack after, or is this animal too strong? Wolves really team up specifically in the winter when the snow starts to fly. And in doing that, that's where you get these big packs, and specifically there's tons of research done on the Yellowstone pack for various reasons. We've gotten into that a few different times, but Yellowstone becomes this amazing area for us to continue to learn and grow on how does this stuff work. What we have stated and seen is what wolves really do, especially with elk, but they'll do this with bison, they'll do this with whatever animals around that they're hunting. First, they're going to try to get these animals to move. And part of that is to check their actual fitness. Check and see, are they injured? Are they hurt? Are they old and starting to lag behind? Are they starting to suffer from starvation? Is there a way that we can isolate this elk and be able to potentially get it out on its own where we have a better chance on our own, where we can team up on it? Is there a way that we can get this running where we are able to nip at a calf of a bison, and bison just run with their heads down? They don't look necessarily forward. That maybe we can slow it down enough that the rest of the herd isn't necessarily going to do a great job at protecting the young at that point. They do a great job at protecting the young if they're stationary. And I think this reiterates a lot of different values here that we in our faith should be remembering. First and foremost, in all of this, no matter which story of David you're going through, or going through Job, or even the gospel text this week with Jesus, the reminder that we're not alone. The reminder that we shouldn't be trying to tackle these things on our own. The elk or the bison is most vulnerable when it's on its own. it's not as vulnerable if it's running with the rest of the herd or if it's stationary with the rest of the herd. But the wolves getting those elk or bison to move is also continuing to help that animal build stamina, build strength, go through these trials and tribulations. And if you are a bison or an elk being chased by a wolf pack, it would be terrifying. It would be scary. There is chaos. There is confusion. I just got to keep running. I got to run. And that's where it also forces us to continue to make good decisions. When you're running with the pack, making sure that I'm not going too far away from people, that I can be isolated, that I'm making a good decision and not necessarily going into the ice cold water where there's a bank and maybe the wolves then are suddenly at the same level and I can't stand in ice cold water forever. It forces us to be staying on the right path. It forces us to be thinking critically. It forces us to continue to build our stamina to become stronger animals. Wolves often get depicted, like I stated, as these vicious killers. What are wolves actually doing? They are the top of the food pyramid, and what they are doing is strengthening the ecosystem. They are making sure that the ecosystem can stay as strong as it possibly can. They are not going to go after a strong bull elk because the amount of work, time, effort, energy that's going to go into that is going to be extremely taxing. And especially if they are unsuccessful, you have taken something where they aren't necessarily super amazing at, again, 10 to 20% success rate. And if you put a lot of time and effort into it and don't get something out of it, that's really hard on the whole pack because then you have to be able to get food. Whereas if we can run them, one, for the wolves to get the exercise as well, but also to see where is the health of those elk, or do we need to look somewhere else for food and let them go? It's not worth the effort. It's not worth the time. That is beneficial for both the wolves and for the elk or the bison. It's beneficial for the whole ecosystem. And as we've talked about in years past with other podcasts, it forces the elk to keep moving and getting them from feeding just in one area. So it's beneficial for the ecosystem as well. So the trials and tribulations that the elk or bison is going through is beneficial for everybody in the long run and beneficial for the individual as it continues to build strength and stamina. The disciples, where I see that they falter, is they don't see the trial and tribulation as trials and tribulations. They see it as something to be scared of. And when you get scared of something, you then are only worried about the self. You don't worry about others, which we've talked about. Again, listen back to that one from 6 years ago. But it also, you aren't moving then. You are protecting yourself. And now you are not becoming and strengthening. You're not trying to figure out how do we work together to get through this. What are the different things that are going to help me be able to run this race better here? Instead, we're worried about self-preservation. And that is the epitome of what in faith Jesus is telling us. Yes, it's an individual race, but you have to work together in this race. There is no way that you're going to be able to do this on your own. I can't even do it on my own. As we follow through the scriptures, Jesus isn't able to do it on his own, and Jesus doesn't want to do it on Jesus' own. We have to be okay and get our heads around that same idea, that we are working together to be able to do something greater. So often it is so easy for us to suddenly just shut down on different aspects of this, where we are, I got to do this, I'm going to do this, and yet what does that do? It isolates us. And when we isolate, it makes it easier for the enemy or the predator to catch up and pull us aside and take us out. Instead, we need to be working and running as a herd and working on our endurance and figuring out from the elders who are in the herd, where are the ways and places that we need to go so that we're not isolated, so that we're seeing this trial and tribulation as actual work to strengthen us. So the question I have for you this week is, what trials and tribulations in your own personal life or in nature have helped strengthen you in the long run? What trials and tribulations in your own personal life or in nature have strengthened you in the long run? There's so much within this life that it's easy for us to get our heads around, woe is me, going through all the trials and tribulations of life. And if you really want to do that, read Job through and through and recognize whatever your problems are, Job probably had it worse. Job loses nearly everything, but the one thing that Job never loses is his faith. And in doing that, Job is able to overcome. Because Job realizes that Job isn't going through this on his own. David, in all the craziness that's going on with Saul, ends up becoming the greatest king that Israel has. Why? Because David recognizes that I have to have this relationship with God. And in all the chaos, especially that's going on, as David is going to be the king of Israel and has been anointed to be the king of Israel, and Saul doesn't exactly like that, David continues to chase after God's own heart. David continues to partner with God to be able to do these things. Paul recognizes this and talks about it throughout a lot of his writings, but this week we get in 2 Corinthians this recognition of things are going to be hard, things are going to be difficult, but you got to continue to band together. You got to recognize that this is stuff that's going to continue to help you grow and go further than you did before. So yes, it is easy for us to victimize wolves. But one of the big things that we have definitely learned with the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone is that is actually strengthened the ecosystem. Yes, there is times of chaos, there are times of craziness, but it helps the animals that aren't wolves continue to grow and strengthen themselves and actually become a stronger herd. The wolves picking out the sick and the lame and the elders, sometimes, yes, that's hard. But it also, at times, allows for the herd to be able to move faster, allows for the herd to be able to be stronger overall. And so often within our own faith, we have to recognize that is part of the course of life as well for all of us. At some point, we're all going to go home. And in that recognition of it's not that we've given up. It's time that we moved forward. We're moving in a new direction. But the herd or group or community of the faith is going to continue to move forward, learning from what we have learned and continuing to venture us into the next phase of faith. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.